During the 10 years of the National Packaging Task Force and since, PPEC has achieved some notable accomplishments, some of them world or North American first. Back in 1990, the Quinte region of Southern Ontario had begun experimenting with collecting old boxboard at curbside, but it needed end markets for the material.
At the same time, there was a brand new industry group called the Paperboard Packaging Environmental Council, and it had started up, and a gentleman, John Mullender, was the new director. We got together and jointly created the Boxboard Task Group. And what was just so fantastic about this, for the first time ever for curbside materials, the paper industry, their customers, the brand owners, who are also the stewards for that package and responsible for it, came together and created a task group that would make a market for paperboard packaging. And that was so successful. And really, it's recognized around the world. It became a model for other industry groups to get together with their customers, the stewards of that packaging, to implement recycling of materials coming out of municipal waste streams.
Back in 1990, there was no system in place to recycle boxboard of any kind. Today, we're proud to say that 94% of Canadians can actually recycle boxboard at their curb.
As the Blue Box system expanded in Ontario, different materials were often strung out in a line at the curb. The local paper packaging mills also developed an appetite for more paper than was currently being collected. A PPEC member company came up with a neat idea.
In the mid-1990s, Metro Waste Paper, who are now part of the Cascade Recovery family, came up with the idea of having a separate box to collect post-residential paper fiber. The two objectives was to divert and recover a whole bunch more fiber, but also it would reduce the amount of contamination. PPEC, once that was kind of developed and Metro Waste Paper, pushed that and approached numerous municipalities to get that in. PPEC also was helping and to get support for that in the industry and amongst municipalities, and they really promoted the concept. So while it's wasn't quite put in and lasted, that was again nearly 20 years ago, but it was really the initiating point for getting post-residential mixed paper fiber out of the household.
One of the PPEC's very early projects was to see if wax corrugated boxes could be composted, because they were difficult to recycle. Samples were sent to the McDonald Farm campus of McGill University, and they composted well. The council also sent some old boxboard there, turning it into compost and producing some fine-looking barley from it. The council had proven that composting was an option for used paper material, far from recycling mills.
On the wax corrugated front, we worked with the Fiber Box Association in the US on initially putting the words in English, French, and Spanish on the wax boxes to differentiate them. That didn't fly too well because I think some of the companies making those boxes didn't want to be singled out as being the bad guys, so it didn't really fly. But eventually the Fiber Box Association came up with a testing protocol for both repulpability and recyclability, and I understand that about 30 or 40 wax alternatives now exist that are repulpable and recyclable, and these logos are used to differentiate the boxes.
The various coating manufacturers stepped up to the plate and came up with alternatives, and certainly in the infancy some worked, some didn't, some worked better than others in certain instances, but eventually they got it right. It was a process, and when they did get it right, the volumes of coatings that we did certainly within our own company just grew exponentially, and we found a lot of good customer satisfaction with that process, and certainly it did take a lot out of the landfill sites. So I think that was a home run. Hey.
PPEC member companies have been reducing the amount of paper fiber used to make packaging for years, removing layers, reducing the size of flaps and the airspace between the product and its packaging.
In the early 1990s, however, PPEC coordinated a major reduction at source for the industry as a whole. We persuaded the Railways Association of Canada to amend its shipping rules for corrugated to allow for the use of high performance or lighter weight board, and which was starting to appear in the marketplace. Up until then, the railways had essentially forced the industry to over-design the boxes, to put more fibre into them than was necessary, to make them stronger than they needed to be, using more fibre and costing more, of course. And we persuaded them to accept high-performance board, and this had the effect of slashing the amount of fibre for a box between 5 and 10%. And that's a huge reduction at source in the amount of packaging used to make the box in the first place.
As PPEC gained credibility within not just the industry, but across the sector in Ontario, it then gave its supporters and member companies the initiative to carry that process on internally, to look in-house to see if there were ways to reduce fiber. And certainly the mills started off with producing lighter weight liner board. Edge crush test became the standard within our industry as opposed to Mullen test, again with the intent of reducing fiber. Plant operations, corrugators started using lighter weight material, changing flute structures, changing board combinations, again with the intent of reducing fiber. Various machine operators were given training on how to, or training and retraining on how to set their machines to reduce caliper loss and therefore make corrugated board stronger, even though it was made of lighter weight components. Waste numbers for our industry were challenged to see if we could set machines up faster with less waste, run with less trim, run with no trim, running orders and combinations to avoid setup costs in terms of lost product and what have you. All of that to say that they were reducing waste, reducing fiber that was being consumed, therefore reducing the amount of fiber that was being used, and consequently less fiber run through the system.
In Ontario, PPEC and Consumers Glass at the time decided that they would look at how activity-based costing was effective. And a study was done to look at the costs of residential recycling, and it indicated that heavier materials such as paper and glass were at a disadvantage in the way in which the province was pursuing its recycling program. Landfills fill up by volume. So why are we looking at everything on weight? Trucks fill up by volume. So this was the kind of impetus for me to look at and question as to how this is done. So went through in detail all the operations and said, what are the cost drivers? And when you do that, that's what activity-based costing is all about, is looking at what drives cost. Is it the weight? And some aspects of it is. A large portion of it is volume. And some of it is just units. And particularly back then when we were doing curbside sorting, so then the number of units was important because that's what was using up the labor and the labor cost. PPEC went out and publicized those and talked to various parties that were important stakeholders in that, such as CSR and the stewards to adopt the ABC approach. It now, and that was 20 years ago, but it now is the underpinning for all the stewardship or the Blue Box stewardship programs across Canada.
PPEC was the first paper packaging association in the world to have its entire mill membership independently third-party certified for sustainable forest management. In fact, over 40% of the world's certified forest is right here in Canada.
But we took it a step further. We wanted all our member mills to not only have sustainable forest management as a backup, but also to have chain of custody certification, independently third-party certified again. And what this means is that whether your raw material is recycled or virgin, that you have a paper trail, third-party, independently verified, to show that you're sourcing your material in a responsible fashion. The three internationally recognized certifying bodies or organizations, PEFC, SFI, and FSC. You've probably seen their logos on different packaging. It is fast becoming a must-have environmental specification for paper products. PPEC was way ahead of the curve on this one, and it lays down a challenge to competing materials to come up with an equivalent third-party proof that they are sourcing their materials from responsible sources.
One of PPEC's more recent successes has been to persuade Ontario's provincial wine and liquor monopoly to change its shipping specifications. For 20 years, the LCBO had insisted that all boxes pass a Mullen or burst strength test, a test that recycled content boxes found difficult to meet.
For the largest entity in the world as a purchasing unit of wine and spirits, it was just abhorrent that they were so far out of date, and their actual mandate precluded us using our own recycled materials and forced us into supply chain things that were horrendously expensive and inappropriate, and if we didn't do it, they would be fining us. PPEC, with the leadership of John Mullender for sure, able support from David Andrews on CCCA, were able to get the audience with LCBO and win the battle.
PPEC coordinated some standard testing on a variety of boxes and bottles, finding that the Mullen test had no direct impact on box performance, that whether the box was virgin or recycled made no discernible difference, and that any testing should include the whole package, not just the box, but also the dividers and the bottles themselves.
We then took the video and our findings to the LCBO and basically persuaded them to allow alternative testing, the method ECT or edge crush test, that they persuaded them to adopt that as an alternative. They announced their agreement in January of 2013, and this was a major breakthrough for us. PPEC had opened the door to producers of recycled board to the LCBO for the first time.
I don't know of any material sector that's asked for its materials to be banned from landfills, but that's what PPEC asked me to work with them and investigate back in 2012. Was, is this possible? Does it make sense? Who's doing it? Who's banning OCC and OBB from landfills? What other kind of landfill bans are going on? So, like, just what's the trend in this, and what are the factors? What are the key factors that are important here? So, we looked into that, and we also looked at who would support it, who wouldn't support it, and why, and just get a real understanding of trying to push this to try and keep as much of the paper packaging out of landfill, and the results that we got there, and PPEC presented to the Ontario Environment Minister at the time, Jim Bradley. I
was pleased that we were able to get the opportunity to meet with the Honourable Jim Bradley, the Minister of the Environment in Ontario government, and we were able to get an audience led by John, and Irving Granofsky and I attended. And our position that we wanted Mr. Bradley to understand as an industry was that we wanted him to ban corrugated from landfill in Ontario. We wanted to say that to him before they got on their direction of some other potentially hazardous set of criteria. Being able to get that meeting within the confines of the government offices was really an eye-opener about what it means to have a platform of PPEC able to speak for the industry. Later, PPEC decided to make it easier for the province, to ban OCC. Things changed. It was a couple of years later again. It was just a year or so ago, and look at what would be the strategy? How would you go forward? How would you implement this? And what are the steps that you have to take? So
So we worked together and tried to identify what that roadmap would be, and who would you approach first, and those kinds of things, and how would the tools work that would make this the most successful. Again, PPEC arranged to set up a meeting with the Ministry of the Environment, and although there hasn't been action yet, I know PPEC remains hopeful. There is new legislation underway, and I know the minister has expressed a desire to move the yardstick forward on what things can be diverted from landfill, and this would certainly be a really good tool. The industry's there, the structure's there, the infrastructure to do it. It's been done before in other provinces, other jurisdictions. Nova Scotia, PEI have similar bans, and Quebec and Manitoba are talking about it as well. So, this is happening. It's happening in other jurisdictions. We now are looking at changing legislation here in Ontario. It's just a great opportunity, and PPEC is at the forefront.
Over 20 years ago, an Ontario Ministry of Agriculture employee was promoting reusable crates, painting a disturbing picture of the Rogers Centre full of wax corrugated headed straight to the landfill. He got the ear of members and staff of the board of the Ontario Growers Association, and plans were afoot to set up a grower-run crate system with the aid of federal money. PPEC sounded the alarm and urgently commissioned a study to get the facts.
We looked at the reusable plastic crates as well as the corrugated containers, and looked at right from the beginning to the end of the cycle. So you've got an open loop and a closed loop systems, and we looked at all the different various financial impacts. So we presented those and to talk to the growers, talk to all of the stakeholders, and presented what our findings were. And PPEC put those out, made them public, and publicized those.
One of the strategies to counter the crate threat was to make different boxes fit more snugly on a pallet, providing a common standardized footprint.
PPEC was a real lead in getting involved in the common footprint for the produce industry. So there was a great amount of effort put together by many of us around the industry at that time, led by PPEC.
PPEC, I think, went from there and passed those findings on to their associates in the U.S., the Fiber Box Association, and they went forward and hired a firm to develop a model that you were able to then look at different factors and play sensitivity with it, and look at comparing, what they were, and identify really where were the key sensitivities, such as how far do those reusable plastic crates have to travel, how many do you actually need, because you need a float in them, or extra numbers of containers. You need to wash them. What's the impact of washing in the water, etc. So there was a lot of factors, so that when they built this model and made it available to everyone, was really useful in going back again and using this full disclosure model.
At the tail end of my positioning with the board and my tenure with the board, the topic of returnable plastic containers grew in status and brought on a number of key issues. All of them needed to be aired out with good, thorough research and analysis to support our industry, to defend our industry, to understand how the level of safety and health standards that we go through to meet standards like HACCP, and then we compared them to the loose opportunities that seem to be running uncontrolled within the use of the RPC plastic container in produce. And as an industry, we needed to stand up. Again, it's very difficult as a commercial entity to get that opportunity. We need the associations like PPEC to take that stand. The argument was very complex, and it seemed to be far too one-sided, but it carried with it the connotations of environment, the connotations of sanitation, the whole logistical effort. If you wanted to get into the environment about the cost of moving crates that were going to be cleaned in Chicago, for crying out loud, and trucked back and forth from Ontario, Quebec, you name it. I mean, it just didn't make any sense whatsoever from an environmental perspective, a logistical perspective. and the finances were highly skeptical.
So we updated that, what were the pros and cons of both systems, and really there was some real challenge to some of the rationale and sales messages from IFCO at the time. And PPEC's been very vigilant and challenging of people who are making those kind of claims for crates as to what they're saying if that is hypothetically how it might work, and how that compares up to the wax corrugated. And that's one of the things I want to mention as well, is that whenever somebody just says reusable is always better than a recyclable or even a one-way or partially recyclable, one always has to question that as to just what do the systems look like. And that's what that project was really all about, as to which was more economic and more environmentally friendly.
Canada's National Packaging Protocol was supposed to be a national program, but even before the survey results were in, individual provinces preferred to do their own thing. At one point, PPEC was forced to take Manitoba to task for proposing a separate tax on paper. It also became clear that money was a big driver.
The reason that EPR began was that a lot of it was being driven by the municipalities that were looking for funding.
Legislation followed, province by province, under the name of Extended Producer Responsibility, or EPR. Ontario brought in a Blue Box program funded 50-50 by municipalities and producers, retailers, and brand owners. Quebec followed with a different program, then Manitoba and British Columbia. Saskatchewan's proposed program is currently stalled, while in Alberta, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia, regulations are not far off. PPEC's role in all this has been to ensure that any fees charged against paper packaging are allocated and applied in a fair manner.
PPEC was at the table when we were developing the cost allocation methodology and the pay-in model. They did a great job of contributing to understanding all the aspects from the paper side and making sure that the pay-in model was fair as it could be at that time to all stewards involved. Going forward, because the system is much more complicated now than it was back when we developed it in 2002, it's going to be just as important, if not even more so, that PPEC stay involved so that they can ensure that whatever system is used to develop the pay-in model, which is used then to develop the costing for the stewards, is done in a fair and equitable manner.
Canada is at a crossroads with EPR, however it is defined. The British Columbia model has certainly stimulated a lot of discussion about the way forward.
Some approaches are very prescriptive, saying thou shalt do this. BC simply said, go figure it out and tell me how it's going to be done, in vernacular. But I mean, that's really what they did. And so it allowed people to bring in ideas. It allowed the industry to put its knowledge into developing a different type of system. And it is very different in British Columbia compared to any other province in Canada.